Hey guys, welcome to Friday. You have made it. Today we're going to take a look at the difference between judicial activism and judicial restraint. Judicial restraint also goes by some other names. You might hear it referred to as strict constructionist interpretation of the Constitution. But we're going to look at these philosophies. These are just different ideas about how judges should interpret the law. What should be the driving factor or the motivation behind a judge's decision. What you guys should still be working on for homework is your judicial study guide and your vocabulary. And you also have that review calendar that we gave you before we left last Friday. You want to make sure you're looking at that. Review, go back, look at some things about federalism and the earlier units that we've done, just so you won't have to try to cram it all in whatever point we come back to school. To start, we're going to take a look at this question: what are some factors that might influence the way a judge interprets the law? So these could be internal factors, these could be things about the judge themselves, or it could be external factors. They could be things that are involved in the case, or things that might influence or persuade a court or a judge to make a decision in a certain way. While courts are supposed to be impartial, we have to keep in mind that the judges themselves are people, and people are going to be biased. People are going to be influenced in many different ways. So if we think a little bit about what some of those ways might be, number one could be the education of the judge. We know that your education is a big factor in political socialization. The same is true about how you interpret the law. Judges from different law schools might see the law, or might interpret the same law, slightly differently based on the education that they received in order to become a judge. We also can look at ideology. Definitely this is what presidents are looking at in terms of selecting a judge to appoint to the federal courts or to the Supreme Court. We looked at this yesterday specifically, but conservative presidents are going to want to try to pick conservative judges, and liberal presidents are going to want to pick liberal judges. A judge's background or their experience, and by what I mean of that is their personal life story, could affect or influence the things that they see or the way that they interpret the law. Sonia Sotomayor, who's currently on the Supreme Court after being appointed successfully by President Obama, she was a big proponent of this. She said during her confirmation hearings that someone of her experience, being a Latina woman, gave her a different perspective on the law that the other justices on the court did not have, and she said that that influenced many of her decisions. Certainly the views of your peers on the Supreme Court are going to matter. We can with reasonable certainty predict, if we know the stance of one of the judges on the Supreme Court, and we know someone who generally disagrees with that person almost always, then we can pretty accurately predict what they are going to think about that. And vice versa. If there are two judges who interpret the law in a very similar way, then we're often going to see them voting together on those issues. The briefs. The actual arguments, the written documents that are submitted by both sides in a court case, they contain most of the legal arguments that would support each side of that case. And so the legal briefs are going to be vital in helping a judge understand what the issue is and to see what the arguments for and against each side are going to be. Briefs are going to come from the petitioner and the respondent at the Supreme Court level. But remember also that briefs can come from third parties, those interest groups, submitting an amicus brief, this third-party argument. All of those briefs could potentially have influence if they contain high-quality information about the case and about the law behind the case. Precedent. Precedent is perhaps the most powerful influence on the way a court decides cases. A precedent is simply a previous decision. Stare decisis is the legal doctrine by which courts are bound to precedent. So if a court has decided a case similarly in the past, they should make the same decision on the current case. This is what keeps the law consistent and makes the law fair for everybody. Without stare decisis and without precedent, every time the court got a case, it would be making a decision for the first time. So precedent is supposed to be a really, really big factor in a judge's decision-making. This is also going to be relevant for when we get into our discussion here in a moment of judicial philosophy. Speaking of which, judicial philosophy is essentially how important should precedent and some of these other factors be when making a decision in a court case. Some justices are going to look for certain things and certain criteria. Other justices are going to rely more heavily on some of these other factors. That's the essential difference when we talk about an activist judge versus a strict constructionist or a judge who practices restraint. If we take a look at the current composition of the Supreme Court by ideology, there are currently 5 conservative justices on the Supreme Court. You've got them down here at the bottom. John Roberts is the current Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was appointed by President George W. Bush, and he's the Chief Justice, as I said. He's got 4 associate justices who are also conservative. Kavanaugh and Gorsuch are the newest appointees to the Supreme Court. They were both nominated by President Trump, and they were confirmed by the Republican-led Senate. Clarence Thomas, he's the justice on the court who very rarely speaks. He's only asked questions during oral arguments a couple of times during his entire time on the court. And whenever he's asked about that, he simply says he was brought up to not interrupt people. He doesn't like to ask a lot of questions when each side is presenting their case at the court. He just likes to listen. The liberal justices up here, we've got Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan are the most recently added liberal justices to the court. Both of these were appointed by Barack Obama. You have Justice Ginsburg, who is like the liberal hero on the Supreme Court. Her fans call her RGB, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And you have Stephen Breyer, who is on the court as well. So in a lot of close decisions, you'll often hear the media talk about how there was a 5-4 split along ideological lines. And that does happen. But by and large, most of the cases the Supreme Court gets are not always decided just on liberal and conservative lines. And there are also times where everyone on the court actually agrees. The main thing that you're going to focus on today with today's activity is this idea of judicial activism versus judicial restraint. So the main difference that separates these two philosophies is how they answer the question that you see on your screen. What should the role of the courts be in making policy? Activist judges are more likely to want the courts to play a co-equal role in the making of policy. So you might see them use judicial review more to overturn things that the legislative and executive branches have done. You might see activist judges overturning long-standing precedent. So for 50 years, the court said this is this thing, and now this group of judges is trying to say something else. That's kind of an activist approach. Judicial restraint, on the other hand, that's going to be much more focused on giving deference to what the legislative branch and what the executive branch want to do. And it's also going to be keeping precedent, not trying to rock the boat so much in the legal waters. You want to keep everything just kind of the way it is. Now, there are different arguments for each side, so we'll just take a minute and explore those before you get to your activity for today. Someone who believes in judicial activism might say, well, you know what? The Constitution is always changing. It is a living document. A lot of times, society or each generation of Americans is going to define some of the things in the Constitution differently than the previous generation had. And the Constitution is pretty vague on a lot of stuff. It does not spell out a whole bunch of things, like what does the freedom of speech mean in the context of the internet? This is something that a judge would have to figure out for themselves based on the available legal arguments and their own knowledge of the law. Activists also make the case that the court is there to protect the minority. If all of the elected branches of government are against somebody, the court is that place of last resort where a minority group can go. And I don't just mean a racial minority, but a minority of public opinion can go and have their rights protected. And so you might enter situations where a court is going to overturn things that the other branches of government have done simply because they're violating the rights of the minority. On the side of restraint, most judges who practice restraint, or people who advocate for judicial restraint, are called originalists. They want the judges on the court to interpret the Constitution exactly how it was understood when it was written. So they want to follow exactly what the Founding Fathers thought the Constitution meant. You shouldn't be injecting your own opinion or your own spin on what the Constitution is. You should be following what the Founders thought, what the people who wrote the document believed. And the really big part of judicial restraint is that you want to let the people run the government. Judges are not elected officials, so they should not be in the role of making public policy. That should be the legislative and executive branches of government. Just because you think a law is dumb, bad, or stupid doesn't mean that you as a judge have the power to declare it unconstitutional. That should only be reserved when there is a clear conflict between the action of the government and the text of the Constitution as it was understood originally by the Founding Fathers. Now, it's important to note here that philosophy and ideology are not necessarily the same. And one person's strict constructionist could be considered by somebody else to be a judicial activist. And this cartoon really gets to that point. You criticize judges, you criticize the court when it's a decision you don't like by calling them an activist judge. If you like the decision that the court made, there's very little criticism of the court as being activist. So, make sure you understand this, because this is a key idea. Liberal judges are not necessarily the activists in every situation. Conservative judges are not necessarily the strict constructionists in every case. There have been times where it has been the conservative justices on the majority who have overturned precedent, or who have overturned something that the government has done. And when that happens, Republicans cheer them. And there have been times where the liberals have been the judicial activists who are overturning something or going against precedent. And in that situation, the liberals cheer them. So it really depends on your perspective and on your point of view when you see the court as being activist. Usually that's denoted with a bad connotation. Okay, so that's the end of your information dump. What you're going to do now is in Google Classroom, there are two opinions from the same court case. And you're going to read each opinion, and you're going to highlight what information within that opinion reveals that justice's judicial philosophy. So find evidence that shows the one judge is an activist, or looking at this case with an activist philosophy, and find evidence and language from the other justice that shows that they are acting as somebody who is practicing restraint. Highlight multiple pieces of evidence in the document. There's lots of good stuff in there to help you show that difference in thinking between them. Once you have that done, then you're done with the classwork for today. Join me back online on YouTube at 2 o'clock this afternoon for office hours, and we can talk more about activism and restraint.